The Pacific Ocean is a battlefield of impossible scale. 10,000 miles of empty blue water separate America from Japan. In Tokyo, Imperial Navy planners meticulously calculated this distance as their ultimate, unbreachable defense. Their war strategy, codified in secret orders, hinged on a brutal geographic logic they called the tyranny of distance. No enemy, they believed, could project decisive power across such a void without their supply lines snapping. The United States would bleed itself white just trying to reach them. This doctrine faced its crucial test in November 1943. At the remote, hellish coral crescent of Tarawa Atoll, the U.S. Fifth Fleet had just waged 76 hours of sacrificial, close-quarters combat. Japanese commanders, studying maps in distant headquarters, received the bloody casualty reports with grim satisfaction. The American fleet, they concluded, was now crippled by the very ocean they sought to conquer. According to their intelligence estimates and logistics manuals, the battered warships had no choice. They must turn and sail the punishing 2,000-mile gauntlet back to Pearl Harbor for months of repair and resupply. The American offensive would stall. Distance had won. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of retreating east, Admiral Raymond Spruance's combat fleet steamed west, into the trackless deep. There, over the horizon, they rendezvoused with a miraculous, hidden armada. Not warships, but a floating, mobile city, the U.S. Navy's fleet train. Over 100 specialized vessels, oilers, ammunition ships, floating dry docks, and refrigerator barges packed with fresh food awaited them. Within days, without ever seeing a permanent port, the fleet was repaired, refueled, rearmed, and fed. The tyranny of distance had been repealed by an industrial miracle. This unseen Second Fleet of over 5,000 support ships would sustain the Allied advance all the way to Japan's doorstep, rendering their core strategic assumption obsolete. But how did America build a moving industrial base in the middle of the ocean? The answer begins not with American genius, but with a fatal Japanese blind spot. Imperial Japan went to war with a logistical system perfectly designed for the conflict they wanted to fight. A short, victorious sprint. Their doctrine, Kantai Kessen, decisive battle, envisioned a rapid seizure of resource-rich territories and a defensive perimeter of fortified island bases, from the Gilberts to the Solomons. As documented in pre-war planning, these captured bases like Truk and Rabaul were the linchpins. They would serve as fixed, unsinkable aircraft carriers, supply depots, and repair facilities. The combined fleet's operational reach was mathematically chained to this static network. A warship's endurance was not measured just by its fuel tanks, but by its distance from the next fortified anchorage. This system possessed a fatal, brittle rigidity. Once a key nodal point was destroyed or bypassed, the entire network in that region became useless. The stunning neutralization of Truk, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, by U.S. carrier raids in February 1944, demonstrated this catastrophic vulnerability. The IJN had no capacity for large-scale underway replenishment. Their oilers and supply ships were few and operated as vulnerable, discrete units, not as an integrated, mobile service fleet. As one Japanese planner later admitted to U.S. interrogators, "We could not truly conceive of a fleet that did not return to a base." This profound logistical limitation shaped their entire intelligence assessment of America. Examining maps in Tokyo, Imperial Navy staff officers calculated that the U.S. Pacific Fleet was even more shackled to its few colossal fixed bases, Pearl Harbor, San Diego, Bremerton. Every mile advanced west from Hawaii would stretch an already tenuous supply line to a gossamer thread. The Americans, they were certain, would be bled white by attrition merely trying to reach Japan's defensive ring. Then, the fresh, centrally positioned Japanese fleet would pounce and annihilate them in the long-planned decisive battle. It was a strategy of geographic interception, rooted in a fundamental belief that the tyranny of distance governed all navies equally. Their confidence was absolute because their own experience told them no other way was possible. Yet, even as they poured concrete into island bunkers, the U.S. Navy was learning a different, more terrible lesson from a jungle-shrouded island called Guadalcanal. For American planners in 1943, the Pacific presented a brutal mathematical equation. To defeat Japan, They needed to project a fleet of unprecedented power across thousands of miles of open ocean and keep it there, fighting continuously. The cold logistics were staggering. A single fast carrier task force, the heart of the new offensive, was a floating city of 10,000 men that consumed resources at a voracious, documented rate. Over 500,000 gallons of fuel oil and 100,000 gallons of aviation gasoline daily, not including bombs, bullets, and food. The pre-war base return model was a recipe for strategic paralysis. If, as Japanese intelligence assumed, the fleet had to retreat to Pearl Harbor after each battle, the war would be lost to geography. Combat ships would spend 70% of their time merely transiting to and from the fight. The bloody, protracted struggle for Guadalcanal had been a stark laboratory in logistical insufficiency. Operating at the very end of a 3,000-mile supply chain from the West Coast, the campaign teetered on the edge of collapse due to shortages. It proved that fighting a war from fixed, distant bases was impossible. The Central Pacific Drive envisioned by Admiral Nimitz demanded something revolutionary. A mobile, floating base that could sail with the combat fleet. This system had to perform miracles far from any shore, refueling dozens of warships simultaneously in heavy seas, transferring thousands of tons of ordnance, conducting major engine repairs in floating dry docks, and even providing fresh bread, mail, and movies to sustain crew morale for months on end. The entire island-hopping strategy, the bypassing of fortified strongholds to strike at the enemy's heart, hinged on solving this single monumental problem. Without a seaborne logistics arm, the world's most powerful fleet would be chained to a dock. The United States responded not with a tactical adjustment, but with an act of industrial and organizational genius. The Allied solution was not a secret weapon, but a secret system, the Mobile Service Squadron. Imagine a city's entire industrial and logistical infrastructure, the power plant, warehouse, machine shop, supermarket, hospital, and waterworks, loaded onto ships and sent to sea. This was Cerveron 10, a typical unit of the fleet train. Its documented roster was a catalog of specialized might. Fleet oilers, AOs, like the Cuxhaven carrying millions of gallons of black oil. Ammunition ships, AEs, like the Mount Baker, floating arsenals packed with bombs and shells. Provision store ships, AFs, with acres of refrigeration for meat and produce. Supporting them were repair ships, ARs, destroyer tenders, ADs, acting as mobile machine shops, and even self-propelled floating dry docks, ARDs, capable of hauling a cruiser out of the water for hull repairs in a captured lagoon. Its operational genius lay in two innovations. First, advanced underway replenishment. While steaming at 12 to 15 knots, ships would connect via high-tension cables and hoses. Fuel pulsed across thick lines. Pallets of bombs and crates of food whizzed along zip lines in a continuous, dangerous ballet. A carrier task force could be fully resupplied without ever stopping. Second, the forward anchorage base. As islands were captured, Seabees transformed atolls like Majuro and, later, the colossal lagoon at Ulithi into concealed megaports. At Ulithi, they installed fuel farms, repair yards, and even a floating theater. This anchorage, hidden from Japanese reconnaissance, could service the entire 3rd or 5th Fleet, over 700 ships at once. It became the permanent, moving home port for the combat fleet, thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor. Standardization was its nervous system. Every hose coupling, every ammunition caliber, every spare part was identical across the fleet. This meant any oiler could fuel any destroyer. Any ammunition ship could arm any carrier. By 1945, this system comprised over 1,000 dedicated auxiliary vessels, the indispensable tail to the combat teeth. The total U.S. naval presence in the Pacific, sustained by this machine, surpassed 5,000 ships. It was the seagoing expression of American industrial capacity, a mobile, indestructible base that turned the vastness of the Pacific from an Allied barrier into an American highway. As 1943 ended, this unprecedented logistical armada steamed west with the 5th Fleet toward the Marshall Islands. Japanese coast watchers dutifully reported the fleet's departure. In Tokyo, planners marked their calendars, expecting the long return voyage to Hawaii to begin. They were waiting for a logistical retreat that American ingenuity had already rendered obsolete. The Marshall Islands campaign, Operation Flintlock, was the fleet train's crucible. The audacious plan, as documented in Fifth Fleet Operations Orders, was simple yet revolutionary. Seize Kwajalein Atoll, then immediately pivot nearly 400 miles northwest to assault Eniwetok, all without the fleet ever returning to Pearl Harbor. The newly captured Majuro Atoll would serve as the forward springboard, but the true lifeline was the mobile service squadrons waiting at sea. This was the ultimate test of the new logistics. After the brutal but successful reduction of Kwajalein, the warships of Task Force 58 were spent. Gun barrels were hot, magazines depleted, fuel tanks nearing empty. According to every Japanese intelligence model, the fleet now had to disengage. Instead, Admiral Spruance's combatants turned not east toward Hawaii, but toward a classified grid coordinate known only as Point Rendezvous. There, over the horizon, the fleet train waited. The scene that followed was a masterpiece of organized chaos. Dozens of destroyers, cruisers, and carriers pulled alongside the Husky auxiliaries. High-tension fuel lines snaked across heaving gaps. Under overcast skies, web cargo nets bulging with shells and bombs swung through the air in a continuous, deafening transfer. In just 48 hours, the most powerful naval striking force on Earth was made whole again. In Tokyo, staff officers tracking the battle lost the plot. The fleet had vanished from Kwajalein. Their assessment, based on rigid doctrine, was inevitable. The Americans were licking their wounds on a long retreat. The shock was therefore absolute when, just days later, that same fleet, now miraculously restored, appeared off Eniwetok, unleashing a fresh cataclysm of naval gunfire and aerial bombardment. The Japanese garrison was overwhelmed, isolated by a strategy that had erased the concept of operational pause. The fleet train had not just worked. It had redefined the very tempo of modern war. The Pacific Ocean was no longer a barrier, but a domain the U.S. Navy now owned. The ultimate expression of the fleet train was not a ship, but a place the enemy never found, Ulithi Atoll. Seized undamaged in September 1944, this vast coral ring in the Western Pacific became the greatest secret of the Pacific War, a hidden, unsinkable fortress that powered the final, brutal drive to Japan. Its decisive moment was the Battle of Okinawa. For 3 months in the spring of 1945, Task Force 58 endured a hellish ordeal off the island's coast, weathering relentless kamikaze attacks that damaged dozens of carriers, battleships, and destroyers. Under the old paradigm, the fleet would have been shattered, forced into a months-long retreat. Instead, Ulithi enabled a revolutionary tactical rhythm, the rotating battle line. A carrier task group, its guns' barrels worn, its crews exhausted, and its decks scarred by suicide planes, would disengage from the combat zone. It would steam 800 miles southeast, not to Pearl Harbor, but into Ulithi's immense, camouflaged lagoon. The transformation was orchestrated and swift. The damaged ship would tie up alongside a destroyer tender or floating drydock for emergency repairs. Alongside, fleet oilers pumped millions of gallons of fresh fuel, while ammunition ships restocked emptied magazines with shells and bombs hauled from their cavernous holds. Most crucially, the crew, hollow-eyed from combat stress, received what no Japanese sailor could, relief. They swam at Beer Island, a makeshift recreation spot, watched movies, and received mail. Morale was refueled alongside the engines. Within 5 to 7 days, a fully restored, rearmed, and remanned task group would steam back northwest to relieve another group on the Okinawa gun line. This continuous, hidden rotation meant the combat power off Japan's doorstep never diminished. It was perpetually renewed. At its peak, Ulithi serviced over 6,000 ships in a single month, the busiest naval anchorage in history. It was the logistical nexus that sustained the title's 5,000 ships. Japanese intelligence, blinded by their doctrine, never pinpointed this invisible city. Their desperate kamikaze campaign was, in part, a frantic attempt to offset the overwhelming material advantage Ulithi generated, a futile effort to drain an ocean with a thimble. Ulithi proved that sea power could now be projected and sustained indefinitely, independent of any continental base. It rendered Japan's defensive geography obsolete and demonstrated that in modern warfare, the true center of gravity is not just the fleet, but the irreversible logistical tide that supports it. The battle it won was invisible but total, the battle of endurance. The Japanese Empire was not defeated by a single battle, but by a system its intelligence apparatus literally could not comprehend. Post-war interrogations conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey reveal a catastrophic, willful blindness. While Japanese analysts knew of underway replenishment as a tactical technique, they dismissed reports of its strategic, fleet-wide application as impossible exaggeration. Their pre-war assumption of American logistical weakness, the core of their Kantai-Kessen doctrine, hardened into an unshakable dogma. Captain Toshikazu Ami, a senior IJN staff officer, later confessed they believed the U.S. advance would be step-by-step, with months of pause between each operation. When the American fleet struck Kwajalein, then Eniwetok, then the Marianas in rapid, brutal succession, Japanese planners rationalized it away. They attributed the tempo to the capture of our bases, for use as fixed supply points, unable to conceive of a fully mobile support fleet. This intelligence failure was operationalized with fatal consequences. Unable to see the fleet train as a system, they could not target its critical, vulnerable nodes, the oilers, ammunition ships, and floating drydocks. All offensive efforts fixated on combat vessels. Their desperate kamikaze campaign at Okinawa targeted carriers and destroyers, not the replenishment groups sustaining them. They never located the central nervous system at Ulithi. When shown the true scale of the service force, Pacific Fleet organization charts after the surrender, Japanese officers expressed stunned disbelief. The USSBS concluded that Japan's fundamental misjudgment of American ability to establish and maintain advanced bases and to conduct amphibious operations at great distances was a primary cause of their strategic collapse. They had waged a war against the U.S. Navy they expected to fight, a fleet chain to fix bases, while the real U.S. Navy, liberated by the fleet train, operated under a new, terrifying set of rules they could not decipher. Their strategy was not merely beaten. It was rendered irrelevant by a logistical revolution they failed to detect until it was far too late. The fleet train's victory did not end in 1945. It became the foundational doctrine for a century of American global naval dominance. The proven ability to project and sustain immense combat power indefinitely, anywhere on the world's oceans, directly shaped the United States post-war grand strategy. The model of the Mobile Service Squadron provided the blueprint for the permanent forward deployment of U.S. naval forces. The 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean and the 7th Fleet in the Western Pacific, constant fixtures of the Cold War, were direct institutional descendants, their very existence predicated on the fleet train's success. They were not visitors to those waters. They lived there, sustained by a ceaseless shuttle of support ships. This logistical supremacy became a primary instrument of Cold War deterrence. The ability to keep multiple carrier battle groups on constant patrol, months from any home port, presented the Soviet Union with an insurmountable geopolitical reality. New, faster classes of support ships, like the Sacramento-class Fast Combat Support Ship, AOE, were built as direct heirs to the World War II fleet train, designed to keep pace with carrier strike groups. The principles of standardized underway replenishment, forward anchorage utilization, and integrated mobile logistics became the global gold standard for any navy with expeditionary ambitions. Yet, despite its world-altering impact, the fleet train remains one of history's great, silent victories. Its story is often overshadowed by the dramatic carrier duels and bloody island assaults it made possible. But historians of grand strategy now recognize it not as a mere support function, but as the central, enabling weapon of the Pacific War, the revolutionary system that transformed the vast Pacific Ocean from an impenetrable shield for Japan into a secure highway for American power, a lesson in logistics that redefined the meaning of naval reach for the modern age. The legacy of the fleet train transcends a single campaign. It stands as one of history's most decisive proofs that logistics is not merely support. It is the central theater of warfare. While tactics and courage decide battles, it is the relentless, systemic generation of combat power that wins wars. As historian Martin Van Creveld established, strategy is helpless without its logistical umbilical cord. The Pacific War was, at its core, a logistical contest, and the United States won it not just on the production line, but in the revolutionary organization that delivered that production to the fight. This episode epitomizes the American way of war. The application of industrial-scale technology, standardized process, and systematic organization to solve strategic problems, substituting machines and management for manpower and mitigating risk through overwhelming material abundance. The fleet train's ultimate triumph was breaking the ancient, constricting tether between naval power and fixed shore bases. For millennia, fleets were extensions of their home ports. The U.S. Navy, through this system, became truly oceanic for the first time, a permanent mobile force that carried its own infrastructure. This created the template for the modern global navy, the indispensable instrument that has secured sea lanes and underwritten international order for decades. As historian Phillips Payson O'Brien argues, the Allied victory was secured not in decisive battles alone, but in the prior, less heralded victory in the production and logistics battle. Today's U.S. Navy concepts of distributed maritime operations and the next-generation USNS John Lewis-class fleet oilers are direct philosophical descendants of those wartime mobile service squadrons. The story of the fleet train is the story of modern warfare itself. It demonstrates that the true measure of military power is not the sharpness of the spear, but the strength and ingenuity of the arm that wields it, and the unseen system that keeps it thrusting forward relentlessly without pause. It shifted the paradigm of naval power from one of episodic projection to one of permanent presence. In doing so, it delivered a lesson of profound and enduring significance. In conflict between industrial societies, the side that masters the art of sustainment masters the fate of the battle, the campaign, and ultimately the war itself. The ultimate lesson of the Pacific War is written not in battle reports, but in logistical ledgers. Victory was forged not by the spear alone, but by the industrial armory that forged it, and the tireless, hidden arm that thrust it forward, again and again and again. The U.S. fleet train was that arm. It transformed America's industrial mass into sustained, unstoppable combat power, proving that in modern conflict, operational endurance is the supreme strategic advantage. Japanese planners, fixated on the spearpoint of the fleet, were blinded to the system that propelled it. They prepared for a war of decisive battle fleets. America waged and won a war of systems. This is a monument to the unsung architects of victory. The tanker crews braving typhoons to connect fuel lines, the Seabees bulldozing coral into airstrips, the supply officers orchestrating the ballet of replenishment. Their work in the wake of the fleet made every amphibious assault possible and every carrier victory sustainable. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's definitive post-war analysis concluded that Japan's defeat was precipitated by the collapse of her logistical capabilities, a collapse accelerated by her utter failure to comprehend the revolutionary mobile logistics system employed by the United States. History's decisive current flows strongest beneath the surface. The visible clash of fleets may decide a day, but it is the invisible river of supply that decides the war. This story is charted in faded service squadron war diaries and anchorage logs. If you want to discover more incredible true stories of the hidden infrastructure that won World War II, subscribe now. We trace the supply lines to victory. Next time, we'll dive into another logistical wonder that fueled the Allied advance. The pipeline under the ocean, Pluto. How engineers secretly laid fuel lines across the stormy floor of the English Channel to feed the Normandy armies is a story of clandestine, world-changing audacity.